Guys, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And so part of the work we get to do then is this Being Human project, and we're going to speak a little bit about that today, because some of the issues we get involved in get right down into the minutiae, but some of it was just like, well, how do we step back? Why are we having these conversations about race and having conversations about conversion therapy and sexuality and identity, about freedom of religion? And so many of these go to, well, what does it mean to be human? I used to be a lawyer. I have repented. It's fine. I was a barrister, one of the funny ones in the wig and the gown. And when I was young, on Sunday nights, I was asked to go and do talks in churches. Did Jesus live? Did he die? Did he rise from the dead? And I had a really good talk. I was really persuasive, but nobody wants me to do that talk anymore, which saddens me greatly, because nobody cares about those questions. Those aren't the questions our culture are asking. And it seems to us we're asking the much more profound question, in a sense, like, what does it mean to be human? Where is artificial technology going to take us? Where's the beginning of life? Where's the end of life? What does it mean in terms of racial diversity for us and ethnicity? These are the kind of questions that are coming up again and again. What is my sense of meaning and value and worth? And where do I find that? And so we are talking about that in terms of the Being Human project. What does it mean to be human? We've divvied that up today. I'm on the bad news part, understanding culture, what's going on. And Joe is going to come and solve all the problems that I identify in the second half. So be ready for that. But the first half is a little bit about some of the cultural stories going on in our world. Let's see what happens if I click a button. Look at that, being human in today's world. Wonderful. I might be in charge. That might be dangerous. And if I look like I'm way behind, please catch me up. Thank you so much. So we're looking at some of the big cultural narratives. And just as we begin, I'm really conscious. I just want to say, like, come Holy Spirit and invite that. We've had a time of worship. This might feel a little bit different. Like, then it's a little bit about some of the cultural stories. But I absolutely think we need to understand the problem as we begin to address and engage it. We need to understand what's going on in culture. In his book, The Myth of Normal, Gabor Mate, who's sort of now come to real prominence for his interview with Harry, if you didn't see that, he's a trauma expert, and my wife has been following for years from our time in Vancouver where he works. And he looks at trauma and development and the increasingly negative impact our culture is having on health and human well-being. And he comments on the kind of environmental pollutants and the physical toxins that are affecting health. But his real concern, his deep concern, as he says, look, the entire context of our social structures, our belief systems, our assumptions and values that surround us and pervade every aspect of our lives. He says, look, these are being polluted, they're polarizing, they're poisonous, and we have normalized that toxicity, and we're unable to see it, let alone even address it. He's not coming from a Christian perspective. He's written a number of books in this area and just saying, look, there's deep problems in our society. The evidence seems to us to be clear. We're struggling in terms of inequality and depression, obesity, prescription drug use, loneliness, isolation. The list could go on. And you're all deeply familiar with this on a kind of daily basis as we pastor in these moments. Over a quarter of the adult population in England has been prescribed antidepressants or painkillers or some sort of related medication. Those numbers go up massively in the States. 70% of Americans are on at least one prescription drug, and over half are taking two. We've got children being medicated in terms of stimulants and antidepressants, ADHD drugs. We've got students who are increasingly anxious, risk-averse, concerns around mental health, and increasingly experiencing depression at much younger ages than was previously the case. We see these things everywhere, the political turmoil, the economic crashes. We see the environmental crisis. We see the long-term implications of the COVID pandemic. And those of you who know doctors and GPs and others are saying that they have little time to ask questions. They have 6-minute appointment slots. We know the issues of even getting an appointment with a GP. So they have no time to engage properly and to try and treat patients, just have to deal with the immediate symptom in front of them. Teachers under increasing pressure from parents and others in terms of league tables and results, and so they just simply teach to a test. We're advertising unhealthy foods right beside gym memberships if you walk down the street or down through the tubes. You know, sports teams are sponsored by betting companies. And we have this vast range of consumer goods alongside the credit and the financial products that will enable us to buy and get the debt and then relieve that very same debt. And all the while, the big questions are coming, the deeper questions. Who am I supposed to be? Is my life significant? How do we live together better? What about work-life balance? How do we cope with the endless social media and the stresses that often come out of that and the toxicity? Where's new technology taking us? What about the crumbling institutions that already exist? And people are experiencing that loneliness and depression, and we're anxious. And what kind of future is the next generation going to have? And I want to suggest that the cultural stories that we are living into, that we are telling ourselves, just simply cannot bear the weight being placed on them at this moment. And what I want to do is look at some of those big cultural narratives and try and understand what's going on. Because the Being Human project for us, and part of the lens, the way in which we see the world, is about understanding what's going on behind the kind of presenting stories. What are the deeper cultural stories that we're living into, and how are they shaping our lives? And culture, I think it's Andy Crouch that says it's the second most complicated word in our language. Culture's complex. Cultural stories impact the way we live, the way we think, the way we act. These stories contain presuppositions about what ultimate reality or God is, about the world around us, about what it is to be human. Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher, uses this wonderful phrase of the social imaginary. He's trying to get us beyond just worldview or head thinking about what's going on around us. It's a kind of unusual phrase. It's not common in our language, but he's just saying, look, the social imaginary is about the way we imagine our social existence, how we fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations we normally meet and how they are met. The expectations we have and how they're met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underline these expectations. Culture is a really rich set of ideas. It's about being and it's about doing, and it touches everything. It is, Andy Crouch says, the activity of making meaning. I love his phrase he has: culture defines for each and every human being the horizons of possibility and impossibility. Like, culture shapes every single thing we do every single day. From the moment we get up, we're being influenced by advertising and ideas and family stories and ways and habits of doing life. And I want to think about some of these cultural stories and think of them as if we were playing a big game of Jenga. As we unpack these 4 stories and how that looks if you've ever played a ginormous, imagine these massive garden sets of Jenga. And the first of the big stories I want to look at is secularism. Stories of uncertainty, the idea that belief is up for grabs. That's how I would define secularism in its simplest terms. Belief is up for grabs. Charles Taylor, who I mentioned earlier, has written this book, A Secular Age. It's about 800 or 900 pages long. I don't think anybody I've ever met has actually read it. People read summaries and pretend. People like me just pretend we've read it and talk about it. It is a definitive guide and it's incredibly helpful, but he explores the layers of secularism. So to save you reading it, I'll summarize it in a minute or two. Taylor says, look, 500 years ago it was almost unthinkable not to believe in God. Now, today, it's almost unthinkable to believe in God. There's been a massive shift in the plausibility structures, what it's possible to believe. And we live in an age in which spiritual possibility, transcendence, the presence of God seems almost implausible to people. And that radically impacts how we think about others, how we think about what it means to be human, our sense of identity, our sense of human flourishing. It impacts all of those ideas. But there are 3 sort of things below that I think really impact then how secularism works itself out. The first is that we live in a really contested world. And secularism isn't simply about unbelief. That's sometimes one way of defining it. But Taylor would say, no, it's about the idea that all beliefs are contested and contestable. Everybody's experiencing the kind of push and pull of the rival stories going on in our world. We live in a world that contests all beliefs and relegates belief as kind of an optional extra for Christians. The outworking of that is often the privatization of faith. If you're going to have it, keep it private. Don't let it into the public square. You can have your faith, just don't talk about it. The minute you try to influence anybody else on it, well, that's where the problem comes. But it's contested for everyone. I want to kind of point out, we are Christians, and we live in a predominantly Christian country. The last census still confirms those numbers. And so because of that, and because of that history, it feels like Christian beliefs are the ones getting pushed around. But that's inevitable. That's our lens. That's our experience. But actually, when you look at somebody like Kate Forbes in Scotland, that's the obvious example. You're like, oh my goodness, she talked about her Christian beliefs and got hammered in the press. But J.K. Rowling gets just as hammered as Kate Forbes does for some of those beliefs. Richard Dawkins got cancelled essentially around his beliefs on the same topic. I would say that contested beliefs actually brought down Nicola Sturgeon from her position in Scotland. And you just need to check out social media for a few minutes and realize everybody's getting pushed and pulled around by this. It's actually contested for everybody. And that leads to a fragility for everybody. Beliefs are much more fragile in this secular age. Taylor has a wonderful phrase that I find so helpful. Doubters are tempted to believe, and believers are tempted to doubt. That is my experience. Let me just pause on that a moment. Just think, let's reverse it, take it in opposite order. So believers are tempted to doubt. It is my experience that my friends who've been journeying with Jesus for 15, 20, 25 years are more inclined to doubt than was ever the case previously. They have moments of leaning out, not necessarily a full abandonment, some deconstructing, some leaning out, and kids come, they lean back in. That's incredibly difficult to disciple and lead with people who are wavering in and out a lot more. It used to be that, if somebody was a Christian by the age of 20, 25, they said that you basically thought you had them for life. That's not the case. Believers are tempted to doubt, but doubters are also tempted to believe. The English author Julian Barnes has a phrase, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. That also reflects a lot of my friends. I don't believe in God, but I miss him. I've got a friend who will not come to our house for Sunday lunch. He is so burned by the concept of Sunday and dressing up in church, and lunch is associated with that. It's Northern Ireland culture, okay? Bear with me. He will not even come to our house for Sunday lunch, but he takes my kids and his kids into our church on Sunday night because he wants them in some sort of value system around that, family values. So he won't come to my house for Sunday lunch, but he takes my kids into church. And when I take his, we share lifts. But I found the most bizarre thing because doubters are tempted to believe in this moment. And we live ultimately then, so it's contested, it's fragile, and it's complex. The reality of the networked way in which our world works means it affects everything else. Imagine running an event and you've got some partners, and we're all agreed on topic A that we're running the event around, and then somebody goes on social media and says, hey, what about topic B? What do you all think of this? And one person says, well, I think this, and then the next thing, well, that's not. So we're aligned on topic A, but we have slightly different views on topic B, but the networked world means, the whole thing falls apart now because we can't agree on everything. It's really difficult to navigate the contested, networked world in which we live. So, secularism means we question the need for God, we reject the overarching stories in that, we privatize our faith. And so if we're playing the game of Jenga, we're down at the bottom and we're pulling out blocks as each one of those things comes along and setting them on top. And the beginning of our tower beginning to get a little unstable as we pull out blocks down the bottom in terms of secularism. The second major story is expressive individualism. It's all about me. So glad you're on it. I was getting there. It's all about me. Stories of the self. The self is the primary unit of concern. Meaning is found by giving expression to my feelings and my desires. These stories tell us that to flourish, I need to know myself, and then I need to be free to project myself out into the world as I see fit. And the consequences of that are the turn inward. We look inwards, we largely reject religion or any kind of overarching story. Nobody gets to tell me what to do. It's all about me. I'm in charge. And so that shift from the Enlightenment and Reformation onwards is a turn inwards that I'm the sole arbiter of truth in my world. We discover and create and choose our own identity, and then we express it out into the world. The turn inward leads to that, the drive for authenticity. We are to be authentic, we are to be true to ourselves, rather than to be shaped by society or previous generations or our parents and others or by religion. I need to be true to who I am. The writer David Foster Wallace commented, everything in my own immediate experience supports my deep belief that I am the absolute center of the universe, the realest, most vivid person in my existence, and therefore, what's my role? To be true to who I am. And that leads then ultimately to a form of really consumerism where I pick and choose what I want. Life becomes commodified. I build my own identity, I build my own brand, relationships become contractual and basically utilitarian. I get from it what I want from them. I swipe right when I choose to. Even when we go to church, I choose the church that best suits my needs. We come out of church and we say, how was church? Well, I didn't really like the worship. I didn't really get anything from the sermon. I've said it, I confess, but I'm totally wired into an individual consumerist mindset. What did I get out of church? It's really hard to break out of that. The role of schools and churches and charities then on the expressive individualist story isn't to shape and to form people, as would historically have been the case, but to help the individual be their best selves, to provide safe spaces, to affirm them, and that creates a serious discipleship deficit. It's not only we can't, there's no expectation that we would shape and form people. And so the starting point is a step back to go that this is even what we're going to do. It's a massive shift. The third story, the third problem. Let's see what happens. Yes, we can skip past that. That was so on to postmodernism. In simple terms, you have your truth and I have my truth. These are stories really of disruption. Postmodernism rejects the certainty of modernism, the idea that science had all the answers, and so far so good, right, to reject that. But it's also led to a constant kind of disruption and deconstruction. When someone says, well, that's subjective, that's just your interpretation, speak your truth, consciously or not, they are engaging and they are adopting the postmodern narrative. Language becomes a little bit ambiguous, truth is subjective, it's constructed. And then the areas for debate around that are really around power, or power, as I'd like to say if I was at home with a Northern Ireland audience. But you'd think I was talking about golf, so I will say power. Power structures and hierarchies in society as we push against them. Thinkers like Nietzsche and Marx and Foucault and Derrida and others. Carl Trueman, in his excellent book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, says this: meaning and truth have been relativized to personal taste. We reject overarching stories, we turn inwards, and then we have our own truth and our own values. So it's a post-truth world. Truth isn't objective. Truth ultimately becomes a bit of a power game where we just cancel people that we disagree with. We silence them. But it leads to profound problems, because how can you have justice when everybody has their own truth? Can you imagine going to a court and saying, I swear to tell the truth, my truth, and nothing but my post-truth perspective? That's a disaster for justice. And so deconstruction destabilizes and disrupts. There was an arrogance of modernity that absolutely should have been challenged and should be. Science doesn't have all the answers. Some of the power structures and hierarchies, for example, around something like race, absolutely need to be overthrown. But when it comes to identity and sexuality, there's this constant effort to keep deconstructing and undermining any norms around marriage and family and then sex and then gender, and it just keeps going. The desire to queer everything. The constant drive to deconstruct, to destabilize. The risk of that is if you keep deconstructing and destabilizing, there are no foundations left on which to build anything, on which to base our lives. And so the three combine in this massive game of Jenga that I've almost forgotten. You're pulling out the blocks every stage, you're putting them on top. And you know when you play Jenga, the bottom gets really unstable. There's one or two blocks in each row. The top now becomes really heavy. And the whole tower is fundamentally unstable, and everybody's worried to take one out because we know they're going to be the person to knock the tower over. And you can feel almost the anxiety if you're playing a game. Don't touch the table, don't go near it. Everybody's really careful, and it's like that's the moment we're in. We're anxious because the top of the tower is really heavy. It's got a messed up version of these stories on top, and it's fundamentally unstable underneath. And we're in the final part, that what I've called the meta zone. There is no name for this. I don't know what I'm, but this is the point of total chaos. This is the relentless, restless space that we are in. Mark Sayers, or some would call this the gray zone. We're in between overlapping eras. One era has definitely ended, whether that's a 50-year era, a 100-year era, or something more. And we're moving into a new one. But as you do that, you've got the last kind of throws and wrestles of one era, the emerging of a new era, and we're in this overlapping, weird space in between. We're in a strange time where I heard Ian Marchant, the chair of Thames Water, recently talking about you've got a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis that are almost like once-in-millennia events. You've got the pandemic and war in Europe that are kind of once-in-80 to 100-year events. You've got a cost of living crisis that was probably last in the 70s, a kind of political, almost zombie-like government of 15, 20 years ago, and you've got these cycles all coming together in one go. You've got so many movements, and we're in this really chaotic, destabilizing, relentless, restless space. And so you've got a picture like monks scream. Somebody said, are they screaming, or are they got their hands over their ears as other people scream? What's happening in this moment? Meta means self-referential. Meta means change. It means coming after. Facebook rebranded Meta for the metaverse, AI, and virtual technologies coming together. In a sense, the meta zone is all of those things coming together, and the instability of the Jenga tower beginning to tilt and to lean because the foundations can't cope. The characteristics of that are essentially we're in a conflicted space. Endless competing stories. We don't have an overarching story. What we have now is millions, literally, of micro stories because everybody has their own story, their own truth, and then they just clash all the time. That's why it's so contested. Because we're not sitting within big stories and arguing about those. We are literally in millions of micro stories bumping into each other relentlessly. It's exhausting because I don't know about you. It just feels relentless. I do not know how some of my non-Christian friends continue in this. I'm like, I don't know how you do this without a relationship with Jesus and a foundation story to anchor yourself into. Can we talk about this a little bit more? Because it's overwhelming. For many people, it's too much. That manifests in different ways of distraction and depression. It manifests in people like the wise Marie Kondo up there, and Jordan Peterson was going to be up. Well, because in two different ways, when people say it's chaotic, Peterson writes a book that says an antidote, 12 rules for living, an antidote to chaos. And Marie Kondo says, well, I can't sort out the outside world, but I can tidy up your room for you, and I can bring order into your little space around you. And in different ways, they're both saying, how do we deal with the chaos out there by ordering aspects of our lives? That's why they're big sellers at the moment. That's why they're hit, because people are like, I want a little bit of order in the chaos that is my life. So what do we say in conclusion, having slightly depressed you and getting you ready for some conversation? The good news is that Joe is here to bring good news shortly. But until we understand and diagnose the problem correctly, I don't think we can bring the right messages in terms of good news of what's going on. Tom Wright says there are 4 questions we have to answer. Who are we? Where are we? What's wrong? And what's the solution? I'll repeat them as I go through, don't worry. Who are we? We want to say that every single human being is a divine image bearer. That is what it means to be human. But where are we on the story? Well, we're living in God's good creation, but the world does not generally acknowledge the good and true God. And so the reality is that though we would rarely state it so bluntly, we are living in a world that worships idols, that worships parodies of the truth. And so what's wrong with the world? Well, if being human is fundamentally about being made in the image of God, and we deny the God in whose image we are made, what's left? To deny God is to dehumanize by very definition, because you can't then bear the image of that God. Like, what are you going to do with that? And so idols and idolatries dehumanize. It's what they do. Tom Wright says, humans remain in bondage to their own gods who drag them into a variety of degrading and dehumanizing behavior patterns. So what's the solution? I've borrowed 1 minute of solution from Joe, otherwise I feel like my talk's just too depressing. Let me say this, I don't want to go too far into it, but because we live in God's good creation, there are glimmers of truth in the cultural stories that we've been looking into. I do not want to narrate a simplistic culture war kind of narrative here, that culture is all bad. So please don't hear me say that. But what we do have to acknowledge is that the truths in our cultural stories have been fractured and isolated from the rest of the God story. They are like fragments of a shattered mirror. Apparently people from Northern Ireland can't say the word for a reflective object properly. So bear with me while I say mirror is what I'd like to say, okay? So we're thinking of a reflective object. They are like fragments of a shattered mirror. And those fractured shards can be really helpful. I can still see myself in it, but they can also be really harmful because they are sharp and they will cut me. And so we see a partial reflection. We see an incomplete picture in some of these cultural stories. But even as we hold the fragment, we can see the risk and we can feel it sharp against our skin. And we need to replace these fragments of truth within the larger story and the biblical ecosystem into the good, true, and beautiful God story to understand what it is to be made in the image of God. Because otherwise, those cultural stories will constantly dehumanize us. That is the implication. That is what they do. But let me finish by saying this. The cultural story is weaker than you think, and the God story is stronger than you think.